The year was 1945. The war had ended, and Europe was still shivering under the weight of shattered cities and broken regimes. Across the Atlantic, a new, invisible war was taking shape. One fought not on the battlefields of the past, but in the minds of people, in the secrets whispered in the darkness of laboratories and the corridors of power. The Soviet Union, a former ally turned rival, had just unveiled the devastating capabilities of its nascent nuclear arsenal. With every successful test of a Soviet atomic bomb, the United States felt its own sense of security erode, and the urgency of finding an edge that could not be measured in barrels of oil or counts of guns grew increasingly desperate. In the early 1950s, the CIA, still reeling from the failure of its early covert operations, found itself under pressure to craft a new doctrine of warfare, one that would not be limited to traditional weaponry, but would extend into the realm of the psyche. The agency's mission statement, drafted in 1947, expressly outlined a strategy that combined political, economic, and psychological measures. As the Soviet Union continued to spread its influence, whether through the Berlin blockade of 1948–49 or the Warsaw Pact of 1955, the CIA began to treat the Soviet threat as a multifaceted enemy, capable of both tangible and intangible warfare. This period of geopolitical tension forced intelligence leaders to ask a difficult question: how could the United States outmaneuver a foe that might deploy its weapons of war not from a battlefield, but from a mind? The answer, chilling in its ambition, lay in the world of psychological manipulation. Early reports within CIA circles, most notably in the Director of Central Intelligence's memorandum dated April 13, 1953, stated, "The Soviet Union is likely to employ psychological operations to subvert U.S. security." The agency's fear of Soviet mind-eye control techniques was rooted in Soviet propaganda, which claimed that Soviet psychologists were already training agents to become immune to interrogation and capable of turning back on their own allies. The notion that the mind could be harnessed for political ends was not new to American thinkers. The Cold War saw an effusion of research from universities and private laboratories into the domain of psychoanalysis, hypnosis, and drug therapy. The CIA, eager to capitalize on this growing body of knowledge, sought to convert these intellectual curiosities into actionable weaponry. In its own words, the CIA's early internal documents noted that the agency would investigate the possibility of influencing human behavior through chemical and psychological means. This sentiment was echoed in the Church Committee report, Tony 4755, which chronicled the CIA's growing interest in psychological warfare as a non-military method of warfare, Church Committee, 1975. The early 1950s were a crucible of fear and paranoia. The Soviet Union had established a network of spies and saboteurs across the globe. The United States was learning that its enemies could infiltrate the most intimate corners of society. The CIA's psychological warfare strategy was therefore not merely academic, it was a desperate attempt to develop a method that could neutralize an adversary without the need for firepower. The program would, in the end, become one of the most infamous chapters in the history of American intelligence. In a clandestine environment where secrecy reigned, the CIA began to gather a diverse pool of expertise: chemists, psychiatrists, psychologists, and even illusionists. They would all be brought together in secret laboratories, often on the campuses of universities that were otherwise engaged in legitimate scientific research. This synergy was born of necessity and ambition to create a weapon that could subdue or coerce an individual without the public eye. The genesis of psychological warfare in the United States, however, did not occur in isolation. The Soviet Union had been investing heavily in its own psychological operations. including the rumored Manchurian candidate experiments. Though these claims were largely fabricated, they still fed into the United States' fear of Soviet ingenuity. Consequently, the CIA's interest in mind control was amplified by a sense of urgency to match or exceed Soviet capabilities. By the early 1950s, the agency was no longer content with simply collecting intelligence. It was now willing to manufacture and weaponize information that could influence human behavior. The CIA's decision to develop such techniques was formalized in a 1953 memorandum from the Ace Director of Central Intelligence, which stated, "The Soviet Union has indicated that it is preparing a psychological warfare program. In order to counter this, the United States must begin research into the control of human behavior." DCI Memo, April 13, 1953. This declaration signaled the birth of what would later be known as Project MKU-Ultra, a program that would quietly infiltrate the very foundations of human cognition. While the political and military aspects of the Cold War continued to dominate headlines, behind the scenes a quieter, more unsettling battle was taking place. A battle that would involve the manipulation of dreams, the induction of psychosis, and the clandestine testing of drugs in unsuspecting subjects. This was the early promise of Project MKU-Ultra, a program that promised to turn the mind itself into a weapon, an ambition that would eventually be revealed as a breach of ethics, legality, and humanity. It would also set in motion a cascade of consequences, legal actions, ethical debates, and a profound societal reckoning with the boundaries of national security and individual rights. In the early 1950s, the United States found itself at the brink of a new kind of warfare, a war not only of arms but of minds. The burgeoning Cold War had turned the CIA into a clandestine laboratory, its investigators turning over every psychological trick and chemical remedy that could be wielded against an adversary rumored to possess hidden powers of manipulation. The agency's first forays into what would later become MKU-Ultra were not glamorous, high-profile missions. They were secret experiments born of a simple but chilling premise. If Soviet agents could break an American's will, what could the United States do to prevent such a loss? The genesis of these efforts can be traced to two projects that predated MKU-Ultra in both scope and ambition. The earliest of them, Project Bluebird, was a CIA project that began in 1950, as later FOIA release documents confirm. Its primary objective was drug research aimed at improving interrogation methods, a modest, seemingly innocuous goal when viewed against the backdrop of the era's intelligence priorities. 6 years later, in 1956, the agency launched Project Artichoke, an early CIA mind-control initiative that started in 1956 and investigated the use of drugs and hypnosis for interrogation. These two projects, initially focused on chemical and psychological interrogation resistance, would evolve into the more expansive, secretive MKU-Ultra program. Bluebird's drug research was, in many respects, the first systematic attempt to catalog the influence of chemicals on human cognition and compliance. The agency sought compounds that could either dull resistance or, conversely, induce cooperation by erasing memories or weakening personal agency. Declassified material from the era makes clear that Bluebird's focus was on drug research for interrogation. The agency's chemists and psychologists studied substances ranging from amphetamines to barbiturates, seeking a chemical lever that could be applied in the field. The lab at Camp Greenleaf, an off-the-record CIA facility, became a crucible for these experiments, where unsuspecting subjects were exposed to untested substances under the guise of routine medical testing. Secrecy enveloped every aspect of Bluebird. protocols were coded, budgets were obscured by layers of pseudonyms, and the agency's technical staff kept their findings buried in classified memos. Yet the ethical cost of this clandestine work was high. Subjects ranging from soldiers on base to incarcerated men were administered potent drugs without fully informed consent. The psychological impact on these individuals was profound. Reports surfaced of acute confusion, dissociation, and lingering mental health issues. The declassified documents themselves, released under FOIA in the 1990s, contained disturbing accounts of subjects waking to find themselves in unfamiliar environments, with memories of the drug's effects clouded or lost entirely. In one briefing, a CIA chemist recounted the subjects would often be unable to articulate who they were or even recall the sequence of events that led to their presence in the lab. As Bluebird's experiments progressed, the agency's focus subtly shifted from simple interrogation resistance to active manipulation. The discovery that certain psychoactive compounds could produce profound changes in perception and memory led CIA scientists to test these substances on themselves. Most notably LSD, which had just entered the world's scientific consciousness after being synthesized by the Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann. The agency's leadership argued that such experiments were a logical next step. If a drug could make a subject more compliant, it could also be used to break a subject's will entirely. The Office of Technical Services, under the direction of the CIA's Technical Services Division, began to view drug research not merely as a tool for interrogation, but as a potential weapon of influence. An idea that would germinate into the darker chapters of mind-control research. Project Artichoke built on Bluebird's foundations, broadening the scope of inquiry to include hypnosis as a complementary technique to chemical manipulation. Declassified memos from 1956 and 1957 describe Artichoke's investigations into the use of drugs and hypnosis for interrogation. The agency's scientists, often operating in isolation within the dimly lit laboratories at Camp Greenleaf, experimented with combinations of hallucinogens and hypnotic suggestions, attempting to induce states of heightened suggestibility. While some reports indicate that these early attempts were rudimentary, they nonetheless demonstrated a willingness to cross conventional ethical boundaries in pursuit of strategic advantage. The overlap in budgets between Bluebird and Artichoke revealed that the CIA had begun to see these projects not as separate experiments, but as parts of a broader, integrated agenda aimed at controlling human cognition. The personnel involved in these early projects were a small, tightly knit group of scientists, psychologists, and intelligence officers. Though the agency's internal records are scarce, external accounts, such as the scholarship of Alfred McCoy and David H. Lawrence, revealed that many of these individuals operated in secrecy, their names hidden behind code words and pseudonyms. The Office of Technical Services, OTS, later renamed the Technical Services Division, was staffed by chemists, physicians, and psychologists who received the CIA's funding and direction. Their work, while ostensibly aimed at protecting national security, gradually expanded into a domain that raised more questions than it answered. Between 1950 and 1955, Bluebird's experimental protocols shifted from broad chemical screening to targeted LSD trials. Reports indicate that the agency began administering the drug to both officers and civilian subjects in an effort to gauge its reliability in inducing dissociative states. Meanwhile, Artichoke's 1956-1957 program introduced new psychoactive agents such as dimethyltryptamine, DMT, and the use of hypnotic induction techniques on inmates. The overlapping timeframes and budgets of these projects illustrate a clear evolution. What began as a straightforward interrogation resistance initiative became a multidisciplinary program seeking to harness the mind itself as a weapon. This shift in focus was not solely scientific, it was political. The United States, locked in a strategic rivalry with the Soviet Union, had received reports that the USSR was exploring similar chemical and psychological weapons. Although these claims were often exaggerated, they provided the CIA with a pretext to justify increasing secrecy and budget allocation. In a declassified memo from 1957, the agency's leadership justified further drug experimentation by citing the need to counter Soviet espionage techniques. The political climate, therefore, amplified the agency's hidden agenda to preempt any potential Soviet advantage. The CIA felt compelled to push the boundaries of ethical research. The legal and ethical implications of these early projects were, at best, ambiguously defined. The Nuremberg Code, adopted in 1947 to establish the ethical standards for human experimentation, set strict guidelines for informed consent, risk assessment, and subject safety. Yet the CIA's programs were largely insulated from these norms, operating within a bureaucratic system that prioritized national security over individual rights. The declassified files from 1956 show a repeated pattern of documentation that glossed over the details of informed consent. Subjects were briefed on the general nature of the study, but were not informed of the specific chemicals to be administered. This omission would later become a defining feature of the MK-Ultra controversy. On a more concrete level, the experiments conducted under Bluebird and Artichoke involved a range of psychoactive substances beyond LSD. Morphine, methamphetamine, and other stimulants were tested for their ability to either increase alertness or induce exhaustion. The CIA also experimented with psychoactive compounds discovered by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann, which had only recently been released to the public. The use of these drugs, often administered without the subject's full knowledge, precipitated a host of psychological disturbances. Several declassified testimonies revealed that subjects reported vivid hallucinations, loss of memory, and, in some cases, long-term psychiatric conditions. The psychological impact of these early experiments was profound, yet it was not fully appreciated at the time. A declassified memo from 1957, which documents subject interviews, notes that many participants experienced confusion and distress after the administration of LSD. The agency, however, tended to attribute such symptoms to the subject's own predispositions rather than to the chemical agents themselves. The clandestine nature of the research meant that many victims received little to no follow-up care, and the agency rarely acknowledged the harm it had inflicted. Hidden laboratories and covert funding further shrouded these early efforts. The agency's budgetary reports, released only decades later, show that funds were funneled into these projects through a web of dummy corporations and front organizations. The secrecy surrounding the laboratories, such as the one at Camp Greenleaf, was enforced by a strict compartmentalization policy. Employees were often told they were working on classified research, but were never given a full account of the purpose or potential consequences. This culture of secrecy and obfuscation set a precedent that would later be amplified under MK-Ultra. The pervasive fear of Soviet mind control capabilities also played a critical role in shaping the trajectory of these early programs. Reports from the 1950s, whether accurate or not, suggest that the USSR had developed advanced psychological weapons. In response, the CIA accelerated its own research, often with a sense of urgency that eclipsed caution. The agency's leadership, operating under the assumption that the enemy had an advantage in psychological warfare, justified the escalating secrecy and moral ambiguity as necessary for national survival. The consequences of these early initiatives were not abstract. In many instances, subjects ranging from soldiers, prisoners, and even civilian volunteers suffered irreversible psychological harm. Families of these individuals recounted stories of friends and relatives who, after a single experimental session, could no longer distinguish between reality and hallucination. The emotional toll on families, while often unrecorded, is evident in later testimonies and scholarly works that document the long-term effects of early CIA experiments. The legacy of these precursory projects is unmistakable. Project Bluebird's focus on drug research for interrogation, coupled with Project Artichoke's exploration of hypnosis and chemical manipulation, provided the foundational knowledge and methodological framework that would be inherited by MKUltra. These early programs taught the CIA that chemicals could alter cognition, that memory could be selectively targeted, and that the human mind could be steered along predetermined paths. In essence, they were the laboratory tests of a theory that would later be codified, expanded, and institutionalized under MKUltra. In the final analysis, the early CIA initiatives were a microcosm of the Cold War's moral complexities. They illustrated how a nation's fear of a rival's hidden capabilities could propel it to conduct ethically dubious research under the veil of secrecy. The shift from interrogation resistance to drug-based manipulation was not merely a change in methodology, but a profound transformation of the agency's worldview. The mind became an objective, as tangible and manipulable as any chemical weapon. The stories of those who unwittingly became part of these projects haunt the history of American intelligence, underscoring the cost of secrecy and the dangers of unchecked power.